Dperry is the former editor of the Associated Press in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. He's also the publisher of Ask Questions Later on Substack. Dan, you're joining us from Tel Aviv. I could see earlier you were listening in to the whole show. I appreciate your patience. Thank you very much. The last time that Benjamin Netanyahu had a deal with Hamas, it was earlier this year, started in January, and he broke it in March after about a month and a half. Can he be trusted this time to stick to this deal?
It's a great question, because you're right, he did violate the previous deal. I don't know if I would ever argue for trusting anyone, least of all Netanyahu, but the circumstances are very different. For one thing, he violated that previous deal with the full permission of Donald Trump, who at that point was fantasizing about a full removal of the Gaza population and a building of a Riviera by the U.S. that would own and run Gaza. So that was a whole different time from what we currently see with Trump, the current version of Trump, seeking Nobel Prizes and speaking of Middle East peace. So I don't think he'll so easily get U.S. permission to do that. The second difference is that the political calculus has changed for Netanyahu, because whereas in the past, an end to the war under circumstances that would leave Hamas in any way in power were problematic for him with his coalition. The far right of the coalition would have probably brought him down, and that mattered to him. It's a ridiculous way of behaving, but most people in Israel think he's not beyond making that a calculation. So sure, there was that. Now, elections are looming in Israel, possibly within months. The war is unpopular. So the previous electoral, or rather political need to maintain a coalition is now replaced by an electoral need to pacify the Israeli public, among whom the war has been very unpopular for a long, long time. I watch international TV and I hear the Israeli public's position largely misrepresented, like they all wanted the Gazans to be expelled. Not true. No matter what distorted polls you see, most of the people in Israel wanted the war to be over. Last but not least, and this is critical, Hamas has now accepted, in theory accepted, the 20-point plan that includes their disarming, at least in Gaza. That was not the case before. That achieves a fundamental Israeli war aim that most Israelis do support. And it would be almost politically impossible for Netanyahu to walk away from a deal that achieves that one thing. Now, of course, they haven't really accepted it. It kind of looks like they did. The Arab League did. Qatar is pressing for it. If Hamas does not, in the end, walk away from that aspect of the 20-point plan, and that's an open question to me. If they really did accept the entire plan, then I don't think Netanyahu can walk away from it. Trump wouldn't let him, if nothing else, but neither would the Israeli people, who, as I say, will have their say soon enough. If it turns out that somehow Hamas has not accepted that aspect of the 20-point plan, then yeah, I think we're looking at a pretty decent possibility of outrage in Israel, a scaling up of the war to cataclysmic proportions with the full support of Trump. I kind of think some fudge is more likely than that. And the fudge I foresee is that Hamas will indeed agree to lay down their arms in Gaza, but not elsewhere. And somehow, maybe from there, lies an optimal path forward.
Yeah, I mean, look, at this point, nobody's wrong by saying that so much about this deal is unknown, right? We can't predict the future. The agreement is on the first part of the deal, and we don't actually know, as you point out, what happens after that first part of the deal, which is really pretty narrow. You mentioned Netanyahu's changing political calculus. I was hoping you could give us a little bit more about that. It's true elections are supposed to happen next year. If it's early next year, as you said, it's a few months from now. So what are his political incentives at this point and disincentives?
His major incentive is to end the war on terms that will be acceptable to the Israelis. Now, the return of the hostages and a disarming of Hamas and the replacing of Hamas with this complex edifice of local technocrats, Palestinian Authority in waiting maybe, but with reforms that most Israelis want, especially to the educational curriculum. Some sort of pan-Arab force, maybe on a perimeter, can't hurt from the Israelis' perspective because they don't really trust the Palestinians to handle their affairs reasonably. And moreover, an international oversight committee chaired by Donald Trump, who's lionized in Israel. This is a very decent outcome from Israel's perspective to the war, putting aside the tremendous cost that the Israelis know, direct and indirect upon them as well, but also the damage to Gaza is not something that Israelis are happy to have been, from their perspective, forced to do. So bottom line, the war will have ended okay if the 20-point plan is respected from the Israeli public's perspective, somehow. But if Netanyahu can leverage this with Trump's help to achieve other political or diplomatic outcomes like normalization or some version of it with Saudi Arabia, maybe accommodations with Syria and Lebanon, both of which will have been made possible by Israel's weakening of Hezbollah and Iran during the war. Netanyahu can flip the script because currently the outrage over his scandalous incompetence and strategic breakdown of October 7th, before, during, and even after, combined with just the misery of the war, has him rather unpopular. He has an advantage, which is the sort of rock solid and lockdown support of somewhere between a third and 40% that back him. The opposition is somewhat fractured in a way, so there's always a possibility he can tempt a few others over and cobble together a majority, but not so likely right now, given what we know right now. But he's a great politician. As I say, if the Trump plan really is implemented, including the disarming of Hamas in Gaza, and he gets other carrots from Saudi Arabia or elsewhere, and then he can point to the aforementioned successes, in particular regarding Iran, and that was a success, without a shadow of a doubt, then who knows? Maybe it's not inconceivable that he again squeaks through. Remember, the 2022 election was basically a tied election. Opposition splits gave him a few extra percent, but he's not that popular. But he's a great politician, so you can never rule him out.
Dan Perry, coming to us live from Tel Aviv. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thank you, sir.
Dan Perry is the former editor of the Associated Press in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. He's also the publisher of the Ask Questions Later newsletter on Substack. You're joining us live from Tel Aviv, Dan. Dan, Donald Trump is headed your way. It's not right now, but it is soon. On Monday, he's there for the big day, which is the day when Israeli captives will be released from Gaza. And as we understand it, probably on the same day, Palestinian prisoners also to be released to Gaza. Some of them might be actually exiled, most of them released to Gaza. What do you expect from that visit by the U.S. president?
Well, the visit is largely an effort by Trump to attach himself to what looks like a success, and a fairly rare success for Trump, despite his protestations otherwise. In the global arena, he's been claiming to have made peace, I don't know what, in 7 wars. Most of that is untrue. And obviously, he's been very frustrated with Russia and Ukraine, largely because he doesn't have leverage on Russia the way he does on both sides in the Israel-Palestine situation. So he's here basically to take a victory lap and possibly to show once more how invested the U.S. is in the full implementation of the 20-point plan. As we discussed earlier, Cyril, it will quickly fall apart unless it emerges that despite some fuzziness right now in public, in fact, there has been agreement to the 20-point plan. This is critical, and I think that is why it's rather important that the U.S. be here at the highest level. And, of course, Witkoff is in the country as well, also Jared Kushner.
Yeah, so the victory lap, I think that's quite easy to read, and it really aligns with Trump's M.O. Is it also pressure on the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to make sure he follows the script?
Possibly. I frankly think the pressure that's needed right now is on Hamas, and therefore circuitously through Qatar, to make sure that Hamas agrees to the key element of the 20-point plan, which is its disarmament, at least in Gaza. If that happens, I don't think pressure on Netanyahu is necessary. It previously had been, in the absence of this one achievement that the plan gives them. Netanyahu does have an incentive to end the war if these conditions are met. The return of the hostages, disarming of Hamas, removal of Hamas as a governing entity. The Israeli public overwhelmingly wants this, and Netanyahu will have to face the Israeli voter in a few months. So his previous calculations about his coalition staying together, which might have required appeasement of the far right with their annexationist fantasies, is different now. He has to satisfy the Israeli voter. So I actually think Netanyahu doesn't really need convincing, despite his terrible record in the past, as we know, walking away from previous agreements with Hamas.
Okay, that's interesting. You're saying his political calculus with elections on the horizon, not too far around the corner, his political calculus is changing. But walk us through that one more time, because what I'm trying to understand is how come keeping his coalition together was so important for 2 years, and now you're saying it's less important than it has been?
Well, it was important to him because he has a Louis XIV complex where he thinks he is the state, and it's critical to Israel that he stay in power. So half his voters and most of Israelis think that that was a big part of his calculation. Whether or not that's unfair, I do not know. I'm not telepathic, but it's certainly consistent with his past. And in the past, had Netanyahu ended the war without Hamas disarming, which again is a difference now, if the 20-point plan is implemented, then the far right would have probably left his coalition, and that would have brought him down, assuming that the opposition didn't step in to save him, which in most cases is unlikely. So, a year and a half ago, this may have been the main thing. But his coalition is not long for this world anyway. So, what applies 3 years before elections no longer applies 3 days before election, or even 3 months, which is what we could be looking at, although early to mid 2026 is more likely. There are many, many things in Israel that cause Netanyahu's coalition to be extremely brittle. Netanyahu owes the ultra-Orthodox religious parties this law exempting their young men from military service, which is just making the rest of Israel's heads explode. That is so incredibly unpopular. He has to finesse it. He probably can't. On that issue alone, that will block his ability to pass a budget by the end of the year, calendar year, and that will bring down the government. So Netanyahu has all kinds of problems, and his best bet, if I was advising him politically, his best bet is to absolutely see this through, most definitely, if the 20-point plan is implemented, including the disarming of Hamas, and then see what other carrots he can collect with the assistance of his buddy Trump, primarily normalization with Saudi Arabia. If that all happens, the war is over, the hostages are back, he's in business with Saudi Arabia, he can claim that he weakened Iran and set back the nuclear program, helped rescue Lebanon from Hezbollah, helped rescue Syria from Bashar Assad. It starts to look like a political campaign narrative for him that might hold water. As long as the war goes on, he will remain quite unpopular. His bet is that he can make people forget about what has been a devastating and fundamentally unpopular war that has Israel in hot water and Israelis in hot water, possibly even past the point of a ceasefire. That remains to be seen. But remember, Netanyahu himself is under indictment at The Hague for war crimes. I don't know if that will be made somehow to go away, but there's residual issues from the war that will continue to make Netanyahu's entire behavior the past 2 or 3 years rather unpopular.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned actually that the ICC legal case against him, because he did name check that when he was giving his speech at the Oval Office, saying no way the Palestinian Authority is in power unless, and he had a bunch of conditions, and that was one of them for those cases to disappear. Anyway, well, that's for another day. But dperry, thank you very much for joining us from Tel Aviv this hour.
Thank you for having me.